The rifle's cold barrel pressed against Nora Owens's temple as she sat alone in the darkened cabin, her finger trembling on the trigger while the autumn wind of 1876 howled through the cracks in the Montana walls. 3 months had passed since they had buried Daniel, her husband of 5 years, killed by a stray bullet during a cattle dispute that should never have turned violent. 3 months since her world had collapsed into an endless gray haze of grief and desperation. The ranch was failing. The cattle were dying from a disease she could not afford to treat, and the bank had sent notice that foreclosure would come in 30 days if she could not pay the debt Daniel had taken to expand their herd. She was 24 years old, alone in the wilderness outside Murphy's, Montana, and she could not see a single reason to keep fighting. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made her freeze. She lowered the rifle slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand before peering through the grimy window. A lone rider was approaching through the golden evening light, leading a pack horse behind him. Nora did not recognize him, which meant trouble or a stranger passing through. Either way, she had no energy to deal with visitors. She watched as he dismounted near her fence, tall and lean with sandy hair that caught the fading sunlight. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, removing his hat as he approached her door. His knock was gentle, almost apologetic. "Madam, I do not mean to intrude. My name is Yale Thompson. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I was wondering if you might know where I could find a blacksmith before nightfall." Nora opened the door a crack, keeping the rifle out of sight but within reach. The man who stood before her had kind eyes, the color of summer grass, and a face weathered by sun and honest work. He looked to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw and an earnest expression that seemed genuine. Still, she had learned to be cautious. "Closest blacksmith is in town, 8 miles south," she said flatly. "You will not make it before dark." Yale nodded slowly, glancing at the darkening sky. "I suspected as much. Would you happen to have any tools I might borrow? I have done some smithing work myself. I could reshoe the horse and be on my way come morning if you would allow me to camp near your property. I would be happy to pay for the inconvenience." Something in his voice, a gentleness that reminded her painfully of Daniel, made her hesitate. She looked past him at his horses, both well cared for and calm, which said something about their owner. A man who treated animals kindly was usually decent enough. "I have tools in the barn," she heard herself saying. "You can use them. There is a lean-to on the east side where you can shelter for the night." "I am much obliged, madam. Thank you kindly." As Yale turned to lead his horses toward the barn, Nora noticed the way he walked, with a slight favor to his left leg, an old injury perhaps. She watched him for a moment longer before closing the door and leaning against it, suddenly exhausted. The rifle still sat on the table where she had left it, a dark reminder of where her thoughts had been just minutes before. She should have felt nothing about the stranger's arrival, but something had shifted in the moment she had opened that door. For the first time in months, she had been forced to think about something other than her own despair. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing, but it was there nonetheless. That night, Nora lay in her bed listening to the distant sound of hammer on anvil as Yale worked to repair his horse's shoe. The rhythmic clanging was oddly comforting, a reminder that there was still work being done in the world, still purpose and forward motion. She fell asleep to that sound, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she did not dream of the grave. Morning came with the smell of coffee, which startled Nora fully awake. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Yale sitting near a small fire, a pot of coffee steaming beside him. He stood immediately when he saw her, his hat already in his hand. "I apologize, madam." I found some coffee beans in my pack and thought I might brew a pot. I should have asked first. I can douse the fire if it troubles you." "It is fine," Nora said, though she felt oddly vulnerable standing there in the morning light. She had not looked at herself in a mirror in weeks, but she knew what she must look like. Thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that had not been properly brushed in days. If Yale noticed her disheveled state, he was kind enough not to show it. Instead, he poured a cup of coffee and offered it to her. "It is not much, but it is hot." The coffee was strong and bitter, and it tasted like the first real thing she had consumed in weeks. Nora wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Your shoe is fixed?" she asked. "Yes, madam. I will be out of your way shortly. I just wanted to thank you properly for your hospitality." He paused, then added carefully, "I notice some of your fence posts are rotting on the north side, and your barn door is hanging crooked. If you would like, I could spend a few hours making repairs before I move on. No charge, just neighborly help." Nora felt her throat tighten. "That is not necessary." "Maybe not, but I would like to help all the same." His green eyes were steady without pity, which made it easier to meet his gaze. "I am handy enough with carpentry, and I have the time." She should have said no. She should have sent him on his way and returned to the dark silence of her cabin. But the thought of another empty day stretching before her, another day of sitting alone with her thoughts and her rifle, was suddenly unbearable. "All right," she said quietly. "If you insist." Yale's face brightened with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "I do insist, madam. Point me toward your lumber and tools, and I will get started." As the morning progressed, Nora found herself drawn outside despite her intentions to remain isolated. She told herself she was just checking on his work, making sure he was not stealing or causing damage, but the truth was simpler than that. It was a relief to hear another human voice, to watch someone working with purpose and skill. Yale worked steadily, replacing fence posts and reinforcing weak sections. He did not try to make conversation, seeming to sense that she preferred silence, but when she did speak to offer him water or point out a problem area, he responded with patience and good humor. "You have a good piece of land here," he said as he hammered in a new post. "Good grazing, decent water access. Must have taken years to build up." "My husband started this ranch 7 years ago," Nora said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. "He died 3 months back. Now it is all falling apart." Yale paused in his work, respect clear on his face. "I am sorry for your loss, madam. That is a heavy burden to carry alone." "I cannot carry it," Nora admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "The bank is for closing in a month. The cattle are sick, and I do not have money for a veterinarian. It is over. I am just waiting for it to be official." "What is wrong with the cattle?" Yale asked, setting down his hammer. "They are not eating right, losing weight. Some kind of disease, I think. I do not know enough about it." "May I take a look at them?" Nora shrugged, too tired to care. "If you want." She led him to the small pasture where her remaining 30 head of cattle grazed listlessly. Yale climbed the fence and walked among them, checking their eyes, their mouths, running his hands along their sides. After several minutes, he returned to where Nora stood. "It is not disease," he said. "It is liver fluke from bad water. See how they are grazing near that low area. The water there is stagnant, full of parasites. You need to fence that section off and make sure they only drink from the clean creek." Hope flickered in Nora's chest, painful and unwelcome. "Are you certain?" "I worked on a ranch in Wyoming for 3 years. We dealt with this same problem. If you catch it early enough, the cattle will recover on their own once you cut off their access to bad water. You might lose a few of the weakest ones, but most should pull through." Nora stared at the cattle, then at Yale, then back at the cattle. Such a simple solution if it was true. I did not know. Daniel always handled the herd. I just helped with the horses and the house. Well, now you know, Yale said gently. Should I help you put up that fence? They worked together throughout the afternoon, Yale doing the heavy work while Nora helped where she could. It felt strange to be working beside someone again, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. As they worked, Yale talked about his experiences on various ranches, sharing knowledge about cattle and horses and the land itself. He did not ask personal questions or press her to talk about Daniel, which Nora appreciated more than she could say. By evening, the fence was complete, cutting off the cattle's access to the contaminated water source. Nora felt exhausted in a way that was different from her usual fatigue. This was the honest tiredness of physical work, not the draining weight of depression. "You should stay for supper," she found herself saying as they put away the tools. "It is the least I can do." Yale hesitated, clearly not wanting to impose, but eventually nodded. "I would be honored, madam." Nora had not cooked a real meal in months, surviving on hardtack and whatever required the least effort. But something about having a guest, about Yale's kindness and help, made her want to try. She found potatoes and onions in her root cellar, salt pork that was still good, and even some dried beans she had forgotten about. As she cooked, Yale sat at the table cleaning his tools, his presence somehow making the cabin feel less empty. "May I ask where you are headed?" Nora asked as she stirred the pot. "No place in particular," Yale admitted. "I have been drifting since I left Wyoming about 6 months ago, doing odd jobs, seeing the country. I thought maybe I would find a place that felt like home, but I have not found it yet." "Why did you leave Wyoming?" Yale was quiet for a moment. "The ranch owner's daughter took a liking to me. Her father thought I had designs on her, which I did not. Things got complicated, so I figured it was best to move on before there was real trouble." "That seems to happen a lot in ranch work," Nora observed. "It does," Yale agreed with a rueful smile. "But I am not interested in marrying for land or money. When I settle down, it will be because I have found someone I truly care about, not because it is convenient or profitable." They ate together as darkness fell, and Nora found herself actually tasting the food, noticing the flavors and textures. Yale complimented her cooking sincerely, and they talked about small things. The coming winter, the price of cattle, the growth of towns like Murphy's. It was normal conversation, the kind Nora had not realized she was starving for. "You could stay another day," Nora said as they finished eating. The words came out before she could stop them. "I mean, if you need more work, I could pay you, not much, but something." Yale studied her face for a long moment. "Are you sure, madam? I do not want to intrude on your grief or your privacy." "I am sure," Nora said, and she was surprised to realize it was true. "There is plenty of work that needs doing, and I could use the help. Then I would be glad to stay, Mrs. Owens." "Nora," she said quietly. "You can call me Nora." "Nora," Yale repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her feel seen for the first time in months. The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Yale slept in the barn, rising early to tend to the animals and tackle whatever project Nora identified. He repaired the barn door, fixed holes in the roof, and reinforced the corral fence. Nora found herself working alongside him more and more, relearning skills she had let atrophy and discovering she was more capable than she had believed. The cattle began to improve almost immediately once they were cut off from the bad water. Within a week, they were grazing more actively, their coats looking healthier. Nora felt a cautious optimism beginning to take root, though she tried not to let it grow too strong. The bank debt was still there, still impossible. On the 5th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Yale finally asked the question she had been dreading. "How much do you owe the bank?" Nora took a breath. $300. Daniel borrowed it to buy more breeding stock, but then he died before we could sell any of the calves. I do not have it. I do not have any way to get it. Yale was quiet, thinking. The cattle are looking better. In another month they should be strong enough to drive to market. If you sold half your herd, you could probably raise most of that money. Maybe, Nora said, but I cannot drive 30 head to market alone, and I cannot afford to hire drovers. I could help you, Yale offered. We could drive them together. Nora looked at him, this kind stranger who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not even prayed. Why would you do that? You do not owe me anything. You have already done more than anyone could expect. Yale met her eyes steadily. Because I want to help you, Nora. Because I think you deserve a chance to keep your ranch and your home, and because... He paused, then continued softly, because I have come to care what happens to you. Something shifted in Nora's chest, a feeling she had thought died with Daniel. It was not the same as what she had felt for her husband, that young, passionate love they had shared. This was different, quieter, but no less real. It was the feeling of being seen, valued, supported. It was hope. I would appreciate the help, she said quietly, more than I can say. Yale smiled, and in the fading light, Nora thought he looked like everything good the world still had to offer. The next month was a whirlwind of activity. With Yale's help and guidance, Nora worked to get her cattle into prime condition for market. They supplemented the grazing with what feed she had left, treating the animals that had been sickest with extra care. Yale taught her things Daniel had never shared about reading cattle conditions, about timing sales for the best prices, about negotiating with buyers. But more than the practical help, Yale gave Nora something she had not realized she had lost: himself. Not all at once, but gradually, he drew her back into the world of the living. He told her stories that made her laugh, a sound she had thought she would never make again. He asked her opinion and actually listened to her answers. He treated her as a partner, not as a helpless widow who needed to be managed or pitied. One evening, as they worked together to repair a section of the barn, Nora found herself telling Yale about Daniel. Not the painful parts, not the guilt and grief, but the good memories. How they had met at a church social in Murphy's. How he had courted her with wildflowers and terrible poetry. How they had built this ranch together, dreaming of the future they would have. "He was a good man," Yale said when she finished. "You were lucky to have that kind of love." "I was," Nora agreed. "But he is gone now and I have to figure out how to keep living. For a while I did not think I could. I did not think I wanted to." Yale set down the board he was holding and turned to face her fully. "I am glad you did not give up, Nora. I know I am just a drifter who showed up by accident, but meeting you has meant something to me. Helping you has given me more purpose than I have felt in years." "You are not just anything," Nora said firmly. "You saved my life, Yale. Maybe not in a dramatic way, but you showed up exactly when I needed someone most. I do not think that was an accident." The air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Yale reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough from work, but impossibly gentle. "I am starting to think it was not an accident either," he said softly. Nora's heart was racing, but not with fear, with possibility. With the terrifying, exhilarating realization that she might be capable of feeling something again. She stepped back, needing space to breathe, to think. "I am not ready," she whispered. "I do not know if I will ever be ready for what I think you are offering." "That is all right," Yale said without hesitation. "I am not going anywhere, Nora. However long it takes, whatever you need, I will be here. As a friend, as a hired hand, as whatever you are comfortable with. No pressure, no expectations." The understanding in his eyes made Nora want to cry. Instead, she nodded and returned to her work, feeling Yale's presence beside her like a promise. The day finally came to drive the cattle to market in Murphy's. They selected the best 15 head, leaving the rest to maintain the breeding stock. It was a risk, selling so many, but it was the only way to raise the money Nora needed. The drive took 2 days, with Yale handling the actual herding while Nora rode alongside, learning and helping where she could. They camped under the stars the first night, and as they sat by the fire, Yale told her about his childhood in Kansas, about the farm his parents had lost to drought and debt, about the sister he had not seen in 5 years because he was too ashamed of his drifting life to go home. "You should go see her," Nora said. "Life is too short to let pride keep you from the people you love." "Maybe you are right," Yale said thoughtfully. "Maybe once we get your ranch situation sorted, I will head that way." The thought of Yale leaving made Nora's chest tighten, but she pushed the feeling aside. He had his own life to live. She could not expect him to stay forever just because she had grown attached to his presence. They reached Murphy's the next afternoon, driving the cattle to the stockyards where buyers would inspect them. Several ranchers and brokers examined Nora's herd, and thanks to Yale's preparation, the cattle were in excellent condition. The bidding was competitive, and in the end, Nora sold all 15 head for $240, more than she had dared hope for. It was not enough to pay off the debt entirely, but it was close. Very close. As they stood outside the stockyard, Nora stared at the money in her hands, feeling a mixture of relief and despair. "I am still $60 short. I have a week until the bank note comes due." Yale was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have some money saved." "Not much, but enough to cover what you need." Nora's head snapped up. "No, absolutely not. You have done too much already." "It is just a loan," Yale said calmly. "You can pay me back when you sell the spring calves. I trust you for it." "Yale, I cannot ask you to risk your savings on me." "You are not asking, I am offering." He smiled, that gentle smile that had become so familiar to her. "Let me do this, Nora. Let me help you save your home." Nora felt tears burning her eyes. "Why? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Yale reached out and took her hand, right there on the main street of Murphy's with people walking past and wagons rolling by. "Because somewhere between fixing that fence and driving these cattle, I fell in love with you, Nora Owens. I know it is too soon. I know you are not ready to hear it, and maybe you will never feel the same way. But I would rather help you and lose my savings than walk away and wonder what might have happened if I had been brave enough to stay." The world seemed to stop. Nora stared at Yale, at this good man who had appeared in her darkest moment and refused to let her give up. She thought about Daniel, about the love they had shared and the life they had built. That love had been real and precious, and it would always be part of her. But Daniel was gone, and she was still here, still alive, and standing in front of her was another chance at happiness. "I am not ready," she said again, but this time she did not let go of his hand. "But I think I could be, given time, given patience." "I have all the time in the world," Yale said, and the joy in his eyes made her believe it. They went to the bank together that afternoon. Nora paid off the debt with her cattle money and Yale's loan, watching as the banker marked her account clear. The relief was overwhelming. The ranch was hers again, truly hers, with no threat of foreclosure hanging over her head. As they left the bank, Nora turned to Yale. "Come back to the ranch with me, not as a drifter or a hired hand, as my partner, helping me run the place. I will pay you a fair wage, and when I can, I will pay back your loan. And maybe in time, we can see what else might develop between us." Yale's answer was to lift her hand to his lips and kiss her knuckles gently, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that it made Nora's heart flutter. "I would be honored." They returned to the ranch as partners, working side by side to prepare for the coming winter. Yale proved invaluable, his knowledge and experience filling in all the gaps that Daniel's death had left. But more than that, his presence filled the emptiness in the cabin, in Nora's days, in her heart. Slowly, carefully, their relationship deepened. Yale courted her properly, with respect for her grief and her healing process. He brought her flowers from the mountain meadows. He cooked dinner when she was too tired. He sat with her on difficult days when memories of Daniel felt overwhelming, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. 3 months after Yale had paid off her bank debt, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Nora invited him to move from the barn into the cabin. Not into her bedroom, not yet, but into the small room Daniel had used as an office. It was a step forward, an acknowledgement that Yale was becoming a permanent part of her life. That winter was hard in many ways. Montana winters always were, but it was also a time of healing and growing closeness. They worked together to keep the cattle fed and safe, to maintain the ranch through blizzards and freezing temperatures. They played cards by the fire on long evenings, read books aloud to each other, talked about everything and nothing. Yale never pushed, never demanded more than Nora was ready to give. But his love was constant, a steady presence she came to rely on more each day. It was in early spring, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of new life appeared on the land, that Nora finally felt ready. She found Yale in the barn one morning, caring for a cow that was about to calve. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up the way it always did when he saw her. "Yale," she said, her heart pounding, "I need to tell you something." He set down the brush he was holding and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" "I love you," Nora said, the words coming out in a rush. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again, but I do. I love you and I want you in my life. Not as a hired hand or a partner in the ranch, but as my husband. If you still want that, if you are willing to wait until I am ready to actually marry." Yale crossed the barn in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I will wait as long as you need, Nora. I told you, I am not going anywhere." They were married that summer, a quiet ceremony in the church in Murphy's with just a few neighbors as witnesses. Nora wore a simple blue dress, and Yale wore his best shirt and a new vest he had saved up to buy. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was perfect. As they stood together making their vows, Nora felt Daniel's presence, not as a ghost or a source of guilt, but as a blessing. He had loved her well, had given her the foundation of strength she had needed to survive his loss. And now Yale was offering her a future, different but no less precious. The years that followed were good ones. Yale proved to be an excellent rancher, and together they expanded the herd and improved the property. The cattle drive became an annual event, with both of them making the journey to market together. They added horses to their operation, breeding quality stock that earned them a reputation throughout Montana. 2 years after their wedding, Nora gave birth to a son they named Thomas, with bright eyes like his father and a stubborn streak like his mother. 3 years later came a daughter, Sarah, quiet and thoughtful, who loved the animals more than anything else in the world. Yale was a devoted father, patient and loving, teaching the children about the land and the animals and the value of hard work. Nora watched him with their babies and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the second chance she had been given. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Nora would sometimes tell Yale about that night he had first arrived. About the rifle and the darkness and the despair that had nearly consumed her. "I was going to do it," she would say. If you had not knocked on that door, I would not be here." And Yale would hold her hand and say, "But I did knock, and you opened the door. You chose to keep fighting, Nora. I just gave you a reason to remember why fighting was worth it." It was true. Yale had shown up at exactly the right moment, had offered help without judgment, had loved her through her grief and into healing. But Nora had done the hard work herself, had chosen life over death, hope over despair, love over loneliness. The ranch thrived. The cattle were healthy, the horses were sought after, and the land proved generous when treated with respect and care. Nora and Yale became pillars of the community in Murphy's, known for their fairness in business and their willingness to help neighbors in need. When Thomas was 10 and Sarah was 7, Nora finally paid back the last of what she owed Yale from that original loan. She presented him with the final payment at dinner one evening, counting out the bills onto the table. Yale looked at the money, then at her, and slowly pushed it back across the table. "Keep it. Put it toward the children's future, or toward new breeding stock, or toward whatever you think we need." That money stopped being a debt a long time ago. It was an investment in our life together, and I have already been repaid 1,000 times over. Nora felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these years, still moved by his generosity. "You are a good man, Yale Thompson." "I am a lucky man," Yale corrected, pulling her close. "Lucky that my horse threw a shoe near your property. Lucky that you opened your door to a stranger. Lucky that you gave me a chance to prove I was worth loving." "I am the lucky one," Nora whispered against his shoulder. "You gave me back my life." As their children grew, so did the ranch. Thomas showed an aptitude for horse training, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and understanding. Sarah developed a gift for breeding decisions, somehow able to see which animals would produce the best offspring. Together, with Yale and Nora's guidance, they built on the foundation their parents had established. There were hard times, of course. A drought one summer that tested their water resources. A winter that came early and stayed late, costing them several head of cattle. The occasional conflict with neighboring ranchers over grazing rights or water access. But through it all, Nora and Yale faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yale surprised Nora with a gift. It was a painting, commissioned from an artist in Murphy's, showing their ranch in perfect detail. The cabin, now expanded and improved, the barn sturdy and well-maintained, the fences straight and strong, the cattle and horses grazing peacefully, and in the foreground, Nora and Yale standing together with their children. "This is what you gave me," Yale said as Nora stared at the painting with tears streaming down her face. "A home, a family, a purpose. Everything I was looking for when I was drifting around the territory. Everything I found the day my horse threw that shoe." Nora threw her arms around him, overwhelmed with love and gratitude. "You gave me just as much. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that life could be good again, that I could be happy again. You saved me, Yale." "We saved each other," Yale said, holding her close. That is what love does. As the years continued to pass, the ranch became even more successful. They expanded their land holdings, buying adjacent property when it became available. They built a new house, bigger and more comfortable, though they kept the original cabin as a guest house and reminder of where they had started. Thomas married at 22, bringing a sweet-natured wife named Elizabeth to the ranch. Sarah showed no interest in marriage, preferring to focus on her work with the horses, and Nora and Yale supported her choice completely. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and women were finding new ways to define their lives. Grandchildren came, adding new energy and joy to the ranch. Nora watched Yale with the babies and toddlers, amazed at his endless patience and gentleness. He was just as devoted to his grandchildren as he had been to his own children, teaching them to ride and rope and care for the animals. One evening, when Nora was 50 and Yale was 53, they sat together on the porch of their home watching the sun set over land they had built together. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, Thomas and Elizabeth were preparing dinner, and Sarah was in the barn with a mare about to foal. "Do you ever think about that night?" Yale asked, reaching for Nora's hand. "The night I showed up asking about a blacksmith." "All the time," Nora admitted. "I think about how close I came to not being here for any of this, how close I came to missing out on this whole beautiful life." "I think about it too," Yale said quietly. "I think about how easily I could have gone a different direction, could have missed your ranch entirely. What would have happened to both of us if I had taken the southern road instead of the northern one? We would have survived, I suppose," Nora said, "but we would not have thrived." "Not like this." Yale lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it just as he had that day in Murphy's when he had offered her his savings. "I love you, Nora, more now than I did 26 years ago, if that is even possible." "It is possible," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because I feel the same way. You are still showing me reasons to keep fighting, Yale, every single day." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of their family, their animals, their land. The ranch that had nearly been lost was now thriving and would continue to thrive for generations. The widow who had lost all hope had found not just reasons to keep fighting, but reasons to embrace life with both hands. The kind cowboy who had appeared at exactly the right moment had found the home he had been searching for, not in a place but in a person, in a partnership, in a love that had grown from the smallest seed of kindness into something strong and lasting. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Nora thought about Daniel, as she still did sometimes, with affection and gratitude for what they had shared. But there was no pain anymore, no guilt. Just the gentle acknowledgement that her first love had been real and precious, and her second love was equally real and precious in a different way. "Thank you," she whispered to Yale. "For what?" he asked, though she knew he understood. "For knocking on my door, for staying, for loving me, for showing me that endings can also be beginnings." Yale pulled her close, and they sat together under the Montana sky, surrounded by the life they had built from despair and hope, from kindness and courage, from a love that had healed them both. The ranch continued to prosper. Years turned to decades, and Nora and Yale grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their children raise their own families, watched the ranch they had saved together become a legacy that would outlast them both. When Nora was 68 and Yale was 71, they took a trip together, something they had rarely done in all their years of hard work. They traveled to Kansas, where Yale finally reunited with his sister after nearly 50 years apart. It was an emotional reunion, filled with tears and laughter and stories of all that had happened in the intervening decades. Yale's sister, now an old woman herself with grown children and grandchildren, embraced Nora like a long-lost friend. "Thank you for loving my brother," she said. "Thank you for giving him the life he deserved." "He gave me the same," Nora replied. "We saved each other." On the journey back to Montana, as they traveled by train through the changing landscape of the American West, Yale took Nora's hand and said, "I am ready now." "Ready for what?" Nora asked, though something in his voice made her heart clench. "Ready for whatever comes next. I have lived a full life, Nora. I have loved and been loved. I have built something lasting. I have no regrets, no wishes unfulfilled. If I died tomorrow, I would die happy." Nora squeezed his hand tightly. "Do not talk like that. We have years left yet." "I hope so," Yale said with a gentle smile. "But if we do not, I wanted you to know that every moment with you has been worth living. You gave me everything, Nora, everything that matters." Tears streamed down Nora's face as she leaned against his shoulder. "You gave me the same. You showed me that life could be beautiful again. You taught me that hope is always worth holding on to." They did have more years together, precious years of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of quiet mornings and comfortable evenings, of a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. When Yale finally passed away at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed they had shared for decades, in the home they had built together. Nora was beside him, holding his hand, and though her heart broke at the loss, she was also grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, grateful for the life he had given her, grateful that he had died as he had lived, surrounded by love. The funeral was attended by what felt like half of Montana. People came from miles around to pay their respects to Yale Thompson, a man known for his kindness, his integrity, and his devotion to his family. Nora stood among her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, supported by the legacy she and Yale had built together. As they buried Yale on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with the mountains in the distance and the cattle grazing peacefully below, Nora thought about the circle of her life. She had loved and lost twice now, had buried two good men who had shaped who she was. But she was not the desperate, hopeless woman who had held a rifle to her head all those years ago. She was strong. She was surrounded by family. She was the matriarch of a thriving ranch that would continue long after she was gone. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had lived a life worth living. Nora continued on for several more years, taking joy in her ever-growing family and in the land she had fought so hard to keep. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about their great-grandfather Yale, about his kindness and patience and love. She made sure they understood that he had been the kind of man worth emulating, worth remembering. When Nora finally passed away at the age of 75, it was in the same peaceful manner that Yale had gone, surrounded by family in the home they had built together. Thomas held one hand and Sarah held the other, while grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around to say goodbye. Her last words were, "I am ready now. Tell your father thank you. Thank you for knocking on my door." They buried her beside Yale on that hillside, two simple headstones marking the graves of people who had lived extraordinary, ordinary lives. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and eventually passed to his children, and then their children, each generation adding to the legacy while honoring the foundation Nora and Yale had established. The story of how Yale and Nora met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. How a drifting cowboy with a thrown horseshoe had found a desperate widow on the verge of giving up. How he had offered help without judgment, had loved her through her grief, had shown her that life could be beautiful again. How she had given him the home and family he had been searching for. It was a love story for the ages, not because it was dramatic or flashy, but because it was real. Because it showed that even in our darkest moments, when hope seems impossible, a single act of kindness can change everything. Because it proved that love can heal even the deepest wounds, given time and patience and genuine care. The ranch still stands today, over a century later, run by Nora and Yale's descendants who carry their names and their values forward into each new generation. The original cabin has been preserved, maintained as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors sometimes come to hear the story, to see the place where a widow lost hope, and a kind cowboy showed her reasons to keep fighting. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the Montana mountains and the cattle graze peacefully in the pastures, some say you can still feel the presence of Nora and Yale, two souls bound together by love and chance, and a horseshoe thrown at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. Their love story endured not just in memory, but in the very land they had saved together, in the family they had built, in the legacy of kindness and resilience they had left behind. It was a testament to the power of hope, the importance of showing up, and the transformative nature of love that asks for nothing but gives everything. In the end, that night when Yale knocked on Nora's door changed two lives forever. It saved a widow from despair and gave a drifting cowboy a place to call home. It created a partnership that would span decades and touch countless lives. It proved that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as simple coincidences. A thrown horseshoe, a knock on a door, a cup of coffee shared at dawn. And it showed that no matter how dark the night, no matter how lost we feel, there is always a reason to keep fighting. Sometimes we just need someone kind enough to help us remember why.